On June 11th, 2019, Pokémon Sword and Shield director Junichi Masuda made a remark that would result in a mountain of outrage.
Players will be able to transfer their Pokémon from Pokémon Home only if they appear in the Galar Region Pokédex.
This single, nonchalant remark in a half-hour presentation would form the basis of an online response unlike anything the franchise had seen before. Gamers took to Twitter and Reddit using the hashtag #BringBackNationalDex and would relentlessly comment it under every single piece of official Pokemon media for months up until the game released. It also launched the careers of a couple of YouTubers.
They are blatantly reusing animations from a 6-year-old handheld game and are shamelessly putting them into a Switch game, which is the most powerful Nintendo console to date.
If all of the Pokemon can fit on Nintendo 3DS games, then why in the hell can't they fit on the Nintendo Switch?
Game Freak did their best to try and calm things down, claiming they needed to do so because of the need for higher quality animations and concerns about the balance of the game. This, however, did little to stop the Horde, who relentlessly mocked the remark, pointing to the fact that the visual presentation was significantly lacking compared to other first-party Nintendo Switch titles. Game Freak is lazy, people claimed, pointing to animation reuse and perceived higher levels of expressiveness in games like Pokémon Stadium and Pokémon Battle Revolution. If anything, Game Freak made things worse with those remarks, and that's a cycle that would repeat itself basically up until launch, and even beyond that point. Today, we're going to examine this controversy from a bit of a different lens. We're not going to engage directly with the conversation, but observe it from a distance, to try to understand why this was such a big deal to people. The biggest question that we need to answer when looking at this whole situation is the following. Why exactly did people get so angry? What is it about the ability to use all 898 Pokemon that gets people so worked up? To answer that, we need to look at the state of the franchise prior to the reveal of Sword and Shield. Criticism of the series started arguably during Generation 5. Although thoughts on those games have tempered with time, to the point where saying Gen 5 is the best is the popular, unpopular opinion among Pokemon fans. Most of the problems that we see with modern Pokemon games began with the release of Pokemon X and Y in 2013. While the games were largely well received, there was a noticeable drop in quality compared to what had come before. The 3D models for the Pokemon are notably very lifeless, with some barely being animated. On top of that, the games have notable performance issues, especially when the 3D is enabled. Which, did anyone actually use that feature? I always had the 3D turned off on my system because it gave me a headache. Back to the topic at hand, however, on the content side, the number of things to do after the credits is somewhat lacking, with virtually no new areas to explore and a single brief side story, which is in stark contrast to what both the 4th and 5th generations have, where about a third to half of the in-game locations were locked behind seeing the credits roll. The last major issue with the games, besides the strange pacing and lackluster narrative, is the changes to the EXP share, which is wildly unbalanced and makes the game far too easy if you want to play with it on. Alternatively, you could use more than 6 Pokemon, but that's beside the point. And while the mechanic was vastly improved later on, the first impression given by a system this unbalanced is going to leave a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. The games that followed, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, inherit a lot of the same problems, but also got flack for the decision to remove the Battle Frontier among a number of other features that, while not in the original Ruby and Sapphire, were added in the enhanced Pokemon Emerald. The reason for this decision was given by Masuda in an interview. Put simply, the Battle Frontier wasn't included because only a tiny number of players would have appreciated and used this game feature. Players get fed up more easily than they did in the past and aren't attracted by these demanding challenges. The 7th generation games, Sun and Moon, while fixing some issues, have a very long intro sequence that has a lot of cutscenes, that leads to the early stages of the game feeling very hand-holdy. While the cutscene density abates somewhat after you leave the first island, the order you visit locations in is fairly linear. Although there are a few optional areas in the game to explore, they're scaled down significantly from what we knew before. The last games that people had a poor reaction to was Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, which was due to the game revisiting Kanto again, which made for the 5th time the series featured this region in a mainline game. The game also replaces traditional wild battles with mechanics borrowed from Pokemon Go, and strips out some key battle mechanics that were introduced after Generation 1, namely held items and abilities. More trouble brewed in the background as well, as the developers decided to take the buffed EXP share and change it from being something you could toggle on and off to something that is always on. That change, combined with the game's more casual, simplified nature, feeds into the same perception that the series was becoming too easy and refusing to cater to its older demographic. I probably spent a little too much time on that section, but it's to prove a point. That being that this small but still somewhat vocal distaste towards the games, built up over a fairly protracted period of time, is going to become important. It shows us how there were rumblings of a controversy. All that was required was one change to cause it to erupt. So that begs the question as to why it was this specific change that caused everyone to freak out so much. To that, I may actually have an answer. Parasocial relationships are a form of relationship where one forms an emotional bond with another person who is completely unaware of the other's existence. Generally, this term is used to refer to one-sided relationships with real people, such as celebrities or content creators, but it is possible to form parasocial bonds with fictional characters as well. This can lead to an increased emotional investment that can lead people to responding in somewhat disproportionate ways. In 2007 and 2008, a television writer's strike led to several shows being temporarily pulled from the air. A study published in 2011 about the incident found that there was a lesser, but not dissimilar emotional response to real relationships. While some participants felt distress at the loss of their favorite TV shows, the distress is not comparable to the distress that comes from real breakups. There are some aspects of relationships with TV characters that may be comparable to real relationships, but the intensity is generally much lower. So basically what we see is it's possible for people to have a strong emotional response to something like this. Spending so much time with a character just to have them vanish is able to upset people. So by applying this idea to Pokemon, we can reason that it is possible for someone to form a parasocial relationship with the Pokemon they catch. The overall design of the series lends itself to this idea. Pokemon are intended to be unique from each other. They have slight variations in their stats, making no two Pokemon exactly alike. You're not just controlling the same static character everyone does like in other RPGs, you're using a distinct character that, even if you use a Pokemon of the same species in a different playthrough, it's technically still different. It's like owning a virtual pet that you pump full of steroids and have beat up other people's pets for money, but we're not gonna get into that today. That's a topic for its own video. Anyways, what makes this such a hot button issue for some is that from Ruby and Sapphire up until the present day, you've always been able to transfer your Pokemon to the next generation of games and still use them. This means over a long enough period of time, you have a very small subsection of hardcore fans who are constantly transferring their Pokemon from game to game to game, until we reach the present day, where they find out all of a sudden that they can't. At that point, even though what is being transferred is ultimately just a collection of ones and zeros, it represents something that the player has an emotional connection to. The bond can also be a little less specific, to where you may form a connection with a certain species of Pokemon, to the point where you go out of your way to use them in every playthrough that you can. Here, the same concept applies. Not being able to catch that Pokemon means losing something important to you. Somewhat related to this is the problem with the way in which we integrate brands into our very identity. An article for Entrepreneur magazine explained how millennials, the very generation who played Pokemon Red and Blue as kids in the 90s, don't tend to build their identities in the way that previous generations traditionally did. Millennials tend to avoid traditional affiliations. 50% of them don't identify with a political party, and about 1/3 of them don't belong to an organized religion. Contrary to the stereotype of the 30-something who refuses to leave the nest, they aren't tied down geographically. A Mayflower survey found that 59% of millennials live elsewhere than their hometown. The rise of the gig economy and pervasive job hopping means that jobs aren't a consistent source of identity for most millennials either. The article goes on to explain that in the 1970s, psychologists were already writing about how people use products to reduce discrepancies between their actual and ideal self, and then goes on to explain the role that social media plays in amplifying this. Millennial consumers don't just seek self-congruity through the products they actually buy. They also seek it through the product photos they pin on Pinterest, the brands they follow on Facebook, Snapchat, or Instagram, the unboxing videos they watch on YouTube. This love of brands is actually helpful in fostering two different attitudes. One where the brand does something that conflicts with the idealized version the individual has constructed, leading to them to lash out against said brand. This is the basis for the Bring Back National Dex camp. Fans have been clamoring for a while now for a proper Pokemon RPG that was going to be a big shift for the franchise. We were going to have the amazing open-world Pokemon game we always dreamed of. And then we saw it. And it wasn't that. Instead of a game like Breath of the Wild or Mario Odyssey, we got something that seemed rather safe. Worse yet, it stripped out a key feature that had been the selling point for the games for years. It's understandable that if you have this idea for the perfect game in your head, you're going to be upset when the company that has brought you so much happiness and joy over the years doesn't deliver. The second attitude is when people make a brand so core to their identity that they perceive criticism of that brand as an attack on them, putting them on the defensive and leading them to do anything they can to deflect or dismiss the criticism as a means to protect their sense of self. This can lead to people coming up with a number of excuses, some of which may be valid, but others may lack as firm a logical basis, as they're coming from a place of emotion, not a place of reason. This has the benefit of serving the interests of the corporations that produce these products, as having a mob of brand-loyal consumers means that you're able to sell them marginally improved upgrades of virtually the same product every year without fear of losing them. This is a topic that I'll touch on a bit later in the video, but I've got to talk about something else briefly first. So now we know why some people were so upset, and why some on the other side got so defensive. But we don't quite have the answer to the question as to why people reacted the way they did. Why were people so rude and dismissive towards each other? Why did people think it was okay to reply to a personal tweet from Junichi Masuda congratulating his friend's wedding? Like, seriously, that had nothing to do with Pokemon. Go ahead, express your frustration, but don't harass the guy. Ugh, Twitter was a mistake. Most of you probably already have a general idea as to what encourages this behavior. The internet and social media. The website 538 conducted a survey in 2016 of about 8.5 thousand internet commenters, looking to find why people behave the way they do online. They found that over half of them were under the age of 40, and that men outnumbered women roughly 3 to 1. The top reason given by people as to why they chose to comment are as follows: correcting errors, adding to the discussion, giving one's perspective, and representing their views. A blog post for Harvard Health Publishing written by one Dr. Adam P. Stern explains that the reason why people seem so angry online has a little bit to do with self-selection bias. People are already invested in the topics being discussed and have their pre-existing viewpoints on the issues. The majority of internet commenters know something about the topics being discussed, and often their personal experience does not align with the viewpoint of the author. Put another way, they may feel that this first-hand experience makes them more knowledgeable than the author, while the author may only have theoretical experience or none at all. Because commenters so often identify personally with the topic for this reason, the magnitude of their emotional response can be amplified, sometimes leading to stronger language than they would use in the real world. He later explains that people tend to comment out of defiance, stating that there may be some role played by the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which people with minimal knowledge think they know everything.
Boy, everyone is stupid except me.
A good example of this comes from YouTuber Distant Kingdom, who I've shown clips from already. During the height of the drama, he got into frequent feuds with Joe Merrick, who runs Cerebi.net and has connections to the games industry. Joe clearly knows a lot more about how game development works due to those connections, and has pointed out some of Distant Kingdom's errors in the past. Of course, pointing out where someone is wrong doesn't always work in changing their perspective. In fact, it can have the opposite effect. This is known in psychology as the backfire effect, in which people who are presented with correct information that contradicts their worldview end up supporting their original position more strongly than before. This has been demonstrated in a number of cases, including voting preferences and other politically charged topics, among other things. People react like this because the conflicting information makes them feel threatened, and thus they seek to preserve their viewpoint as a means of preserving their current sense of self. This leads to discourse becoming increasingly more hostile, as no one is really listening to each other, but rather digging their heels in and clinging to the same narrative. This is all amplified by the fact that people are anonymous online, and that anonymity causes people to view the people that they are arguing with not as people, but as some nebulous abstraction. It's also far easier to use more aggressive language in writing than it is in speech. The delayed nature of responses also allows people to go off on lengthy screeds that basically no one could get away with in a conversation in real life. The lack of traditional cues found in face-to-face conversations, such as tone of voice and physical gestures, also add to this issue. Edward Wasserman, a professor of journalism ethics at Washington and Lee University, also notes that what is considered an acceptable way to respond is partly shaped by the mainstream media. Unfortunately, the mainstream media have made a fortune teaching people the wrong way to talk to each other. Offering up Jerry Springer, Crossfire, Bill O'Reilly, people understandably conclude rage is the political vernacular. And this is how public ideas are talked about. So basically, we have a situation where people with strong emotional investment in a given topic, who think they know everything, shielded by the anonymity of the internet, lash out at others who contradict their worldview in an effort to preserve their own sense of self. But let's move on to the truly important topic of discussion. Did the backlash work? What do you think? Since when has a gamer boycott ever actually worked? In fact, controversy can actually benefit sales. As media and cultural critic H. Bomber Guy pointed out, having a boycott that originates on Twitter, with a hashtag going around, leads to a lot of eyes being placed on a brand that otherwise might not have been. The game becomes the topic of conversation, and people look at it and ask if it's really that bad, or if people are just overreacting, which some people might actually buy to see for themselves. I'm not going to claim that this move was a deliberate ploy by Game Freak to create a controversy. I think this was completely unintentional on their part, but I do want to point out how this is very similar to the ways in which corporations engage in outrage marketing, in some cases to great success. Basically, the Bring Back National Dex crowd inadvertently succeeded in giving Game Freak and Nintendo millions of dollars in free advertising. We can't say how much of an impact that had, but the game did become the fastest selling Nintendo Switch game until it was dethroned 3 months later by Animal Crossing New Horizons, a game that itself was the subject of a controversy, although I think we all know the real reason why that game did so well. There were other reasons as to why this campaign was bound to fail. In an article for Forbes magazine, journalist David Tier, I really hope I'm pronouncing that right, noted, "Nobody in a position to care about something like a limited Pokédex is actually going to boycott that game, at least not in numbers greater than rounding errors. These are the hardest core fans of a franchise, and they're just not going to skip the new titles. Most likely, these are the sorts of players that are not going to skip either new title." And when you account for the largely online nature of these boycotts, which leads to a lack of accountability, I think you know what happens. Does it really matter if I buy the game or not? Like, I'm just one person. It's not like I'm going to have that big of an impact, right? Multiply that by a couple 100,000 people, and you get my point. Not like it mattered anyways, as this is a very slim minority of people because of one simple reason. You ready for it? Twitter isn't real life. I mean that sincerely. Out of a world of 7.5 billion people, only about 340 million of them use Twitter. Likely less when you account for bots, corporations, and people having multiple accounts. Looking at the United States in particular, only 22% of Americans have a Twitter account, and 80% of tweets come from 10% of users. For most people, the unrepresentative nature of Twitter and other sites like YouTube is obfuscated by the algorithms these websites employ, which do what they can to continually serve you content it thinks you'll engage with, leading to a reinforcement loop that causes you to become steeped in content that continually confirms your own biases. This can lead to a warped view of what the general public actually thinks about a given issue. This is why you can't always trust user-submitted review scores, due to issues of people brigading unpopular games and movies to try to bring the score down, sometimes for reasons as petty as the platform it's available on. Now, granted, I have cited Metacritic in the past, mainly in my Mystery Dungeon videos, and to be frank, I think there is an extent to which that may not have been the best approach depending on the situation. I don't think that applied too heavily to any of the instances I've used it, but it's worth acknowledging as a flaw with using the website as the only source to back up your point. My general point here is that the internet is very unrepresentative of the consumer base, and being terminally online can lead to a distorted view of what people actually think. This is why so many boycotts fail, because the limited outreach makes it impossible to organize effectively in quantities large enough to actually do anything, especially as corporations become larger and larger and harder to take down. The only instance of a gamer boycott working was the one against Star Wars Battlefront 2, and that had a lot to do with the way the media picked up on the story and the attention given to it by lawmakers who floated the idea of regulations, which is what corporations fear above all else. This actually caused a stir that was significant enough to a lot of people that it led to an impact, something that, as I've already mentioned, Bring Back National Pokédex simply didn't have. I said at the beginning I wasn't going to take sides, and I'm sticking to that in the sense that I'm not going to comment directly on whether or not it was the right decision to remove Pokemon from the game. But I do want to make the very important point that Game Freak did what they did, putting the bare minimum effort into the game for one simple reason. They have no incentive to do otherwise. People are calling the behavior on the part of Game Freak laziness and greed, which I guess is accurate, but I think using terms like that obfuscates what the true problem is. Simply put, getting as much money while putting in as little as possible is the only thing that motivates corporations. I've alluded to this multiple times already, but corporations aren't your friends. They're private businesses who only care about pleasing their shareholders that want to see a constant increase in profits. This behavior from developers is not a bug in the system, it's a feature. This is why Game Freak reuses as many animations and models as they can. Simply put, it costs less. This is the reason why Nintendo did the bare minimum needed to get Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Galaxy running on the Switch. This also happens to be the reason for Nintendo getting more and more brazen with using limited release windows to generate a sense of FOMO among its consumers. Talking on the issue of Super Mario 3D All-Stars, Jeff Grubb, writing for VentureBeat, cut straight to the core of this issue. I should make it clear that I understand this behavior is a byproduct of a system. Capitalism, especially where publicly traded companies are involved, demands that companies make the most money while using the fewest possible resources. And when a company like Nintendo has this option, it is almost compelled to take it. But that almost is important. I too live under capitalism. And like you, I face the temptation of making more money through simpler and shadier means. If I wanted to grow my bank account faster, I could start making videos about video game feminism to exploit the YouTube algorithm. Or I could post obviously dubious rumors with clickbait headlines, which is something I see all the time on Google News. But I don't, because I have higher standards for my reporting. Having standards is detrimental to your income, but if we can make that decision, so can Nintendo. Yet these companies have no reason to raise their standards because they've become so large and ubiquitous that they're guaranteed to turn a profit regardless. There are obviously other games that are similar to Mario or Pokemon, but so few people know about them, it's hard for them to make a dent in the market. People don't want a game that's like Mario, they want Mario. The instant recognition of the brand allows companies to do less to get people to buy it. This problem places us in a bit of a bind as consumers. Simply put, there is close to nothing we can do. As I mentioned, the boycott failed because not enough people cared. This leaves us as hardcore fans with a sense of powerlessness. The fan game community does a great job of filling the holes left by developers, and I've argued way back during the beginning of this channel that that is a good thing, but that's an imperfect solution. As we all know, Nintendo is aggressive with protecting its copyrights, and shuts down virtually any fan project that gets too ambitious. This problem is amplified by the fact that pretty much every video game franchise in existence will likely never enter the public domain because a certain company that shall remain nameless, Disney, has constantly lobbied the government to continually extend copyright, an employ that serves to only benefit them and other corporations, as it ensures that they have a complete monopoly by which to milk franchises until the end of time. Laziness and greed isn't the problem here, but rather a system that, by its very design, encourages this kind of behavior from corporations that continue to get larger and more consolidated, knowing that they will still likely turn a profit. I don't mean to sound like a defeatist, but right now, there isn't much of a chance that we're going to see some massive shift in the series. There have been some improvements, sure, but overall Game Freak has found a formula that works, and they're not going to do much to change it. If that upsets you, then I would highly suggest you check out some of the fan-made projects that have been released over the years. I know they're not technically legal, but until Game Freak gets their shit together, this is all we've got. The people who create these games put a lot of work in, completely for free I might add, just to show their love and dedication for the series. Checking out their work is the least we can do. As someone who generally liked Sword and Shield, although I do have my problems with it when it comes to the difficulty, story, and level design, I came into this with a bit of a different perspective than a lot of people. My goal was to explore the reasoning as to why this of all things upset people, and I'm pretty satisfied with the conclusion that I came up with. I do still believe the way people went about expressing their discontent crossed some lines, and I do still think that Twitter was a mistake. Hashtag cancel Twitter. Ultimately, the issue does come down to the nature of the world we live in. One where corporations continue to dominate more and more of our lives. But that shouldn't discourage us. If anything should be taken away from this video, it's this. Fandoms create passionate groups of people who have strong opinions about what they like and what the franchises they consume should be. And sometimes, we take it too far. But the important thing is that you are allowed to express those opinions. Make it known what you believe. Shout it to the world. Let the powers that be know that you're angry. But be respectful of others' opinions. And don't call people shills or simps or anything like that. Trust me, name-calling generally isn't a good persuasive technique. Gamers, and especially Nintendo fans, have a bad reputation of being entitled, whiny brats. And the only way we change that perception is to be more tactful in how we express our grievances. And yes, that may require more than 280 characters to do. Seriously, Twitter was a mistake.